Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host, Pastor S.J. Munson, is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of Christianity. Find them wherever great books are sold. Now, here he is, your host, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Fascism and the far right have been much in the news of late as the U.S. grapples with perhaps the greatest threat to our democracy ever encountered in our history. Fascism is a word much misunderstood and even misused, and here to help us sort through what it is and what it is not, and how to keep young men from being recruited. We have Dr. Craig Johnson. He is a PhD and an independent journalist and academic and host of the popular podcast 15 Minutes of Fascism, which covers the global rise of the radical right. He received his PhD in history from the University of California at Berkeley, and he's the author of a new book, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism, a guide for parents and educators on keeping young men out of the extreme right wing. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for being on the show, making time for us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk.
Now, how did you get interested in studying fascism and the far right?
Yeah, well, when it comes to an academic career, usually you want to pick something to study that will motivate you for years and years, right? You know, you need to be able to pay attention to it, dedicate your life to it, wake up and be thinking about it. And to me, fascism is that thing because I'm afraid of it, because I'm afraid of it and I hate it. And I find it very motivating, you know, in the same way that a person might study a very dangerous disease and dedicate their life to it.
Okay. Now, fascism is a term, as you point out in your book, too, that's easily thrown around by both sides of the political spectrum. Sometimes anyone whom we don't like can be a fascist, but it does have a specific definition, doesn't it? And could you define that for us and tell us what it is, or maybe also what it is not?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the most helpful places to start when you think about what fascism is to compare it to other things that it isn't, exactly like you suggested. When we talk about fascism, like you said, a lot of times people use it as a pejorative. They use it as an insult, and you just call anybody who is to your right or even potentially to your left a fascist. This is fascism, the definition being like stuff I don't like, right? You know, my mom tells me to go to bed at 11 p.m. because I have a test tomorrow. It's fascism, right? A cop stops me because I sped through a red light. That's fascism, right? That's not what fascism is. Another thing that fascism definitely isn't is, for example, the presidency of George W. Bush. If you and your listeners recall from the time of the dominance of the neocons and the Christian evangelical bloc, a lot of people on the left, a lot of progressives described that as fascism. They would say like, "Oh, he's a fascist. That's why we need to oppose him." He is not a fascist. His movement was not a fascist. Like, fascism differs from mainstream conservatism in a couple key ways. The primary ways are that fascism is revolutionary. Fascism doesn't just want to make the way that the world works be more stable or more permanent. They're not trying to protect the status quo. They want to build a radical, new, and terrifying world. And that world is sort of like in the image of their imagination about what the past used to be. You know, they want male supremacy. They want, in most cases, white supremacy, in most cases, Christian supremacy, although that's not universal because there are non-Christian and non-white fascisms, like, for example, in India. The other thing that really differentiates conservatives and fascists is that conservatives, like most everybody else in the political spectrum, they think that violence might sometimes be useful. You know, you might need to be violent sometimes in order to get what you want. That's how most political movements think about violence. Fascists are different. Fascists believe that violence is good, full stop. They think that it is good for you to be violent, and it is good for the world for there to be violent people in it. Fascists want political violence. They like fighting in the street. This is as opposed to people like, for example, Antifa, who do engage in violence against fascists, but they do it because they think fascism needs to be stopped, not because they think that violence is good. These are very different things, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want a very short definition of fascism, fascism is a revolutionary, right-wing, male supremacist, usually racist and usually Christian nationalist movement that is about violently creating a new world.
How did you get started writing this book in particular?
Yeah, so when you tell people, if you're at a party or at a bar or at a faculty meeting and you tell people that you study fascism, their reaction is a little bit different than if you tell them that you study, for example, like 18th century Whig culture or something. When you tell them that you study fascism, usually they're like, "Oh crap, what am I supposed to do?" Like they ask you practical questions about the real world, and there are historical examples about how to deal with fascism, how to stop its rise, but they're very different. Those times and the way politics worked was very different compared to how things are today. And so, I found myself wanting to have answers, wanting to have good, practicable, actionable answers for people. And I knew that I needed to write a book in order to be able to arrive at those answers myself.
Hmm. Now, the title of your book, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism, very specific target. But why are we talking about young men specifically, and how big of a problem is this currently?
Yeah, those are both really extremely good questions. Why young men specifically is for a couple reasons. One is that fascists go after young men on purpose. They go after young men in order to recruit them. And they go after young men to recruit them because they need young men, and also because young men are particularly susceptible to fascism. So we know that they go after young men specifically, and this is something that fascists are just on record about, both in the 20s and 30s, but also today. One of the only contemporary fascists that I mentioned by name is a man named Anglin. Anglin runs, or at least ran, the Daily Stormer, which was, at the time of my writing the book, which, I drafted the book 2 years ago. So this may or may not be the case anymore. But at the time, and for a long time, the Daily Stormer was the largest neo-Nazi website in the United States. And Anglin was very clear about what he was doing on the internet. He started this website. He started his sort of presence on the internet back in the 2010s. And he was very clear in saying, what I'm going after is the 10-year-olds. I want 10-year-old boys to become fascists. Because that means that I'll have them for life, This is also when they're particularly ideologically and intellectually vulnerable. Their brains are starting to work in such a way that you can talk to them about serious things, but their brains are not so fully developed that they have full capacity in terms of risk analysis, risk assessment, knowing what dangers current actions pose to them, right? That doesn't really come to adult human brains until they're about somewhere between 23 and 26. And so if you go after young men, they are particularly intellectually vulnerable. They're particularly ideologically vulnerable. And this is for another reason that fascists go after young men, especially in the United States today, but this has also been the case throughout most of fascism's history. Remember that fascism began as a movement of veterans of World War I. And this was a time of mass conscription. Veterans were young. They were teenage boys, right? Teenagers in early 20s. The other reason that fascism goes after young men is that fascism tells people a story about how privileged people are being oppressed, right? That's one of the key ideas that fascism has, is that whereas in reality we know that sexism oppresses women, non-binary people, and privileges men. And in reality we know that racism oppresses people of color and privileges white people. And in reality, we know that homophobia privileges straight people and punishes queer people. Fascism tells you the opposite. And it's not unique in this regard, like lots of right-wing movements tell you the opposite. But fascism specifically says, you are a vulnerable, targeted class. You are being oppressed. And that's particularly important because when fascism talks about the oppression of privileged people, they get a lot of benefit from telling that to young people. Because young people, pretty uniquely, have not really experienced the privileges that come with who they are, right? A young person is not in control of his life. A young man is not in control of his life. He might not get to choose where he lives, where he goes to school, when he wakes up, what food he eats, right? This is not a position of privilege. And so it is pretty easy, it's relatively easy, to tell a 13-year-old boy, you are a member of an oppressed class. Because he feels that way. And his brain is sort of like uniquely unprepared to consider the long game and the long-term stuff, and to be like, okay, well, this might feel like oppression now, but statistically I know that being raised in this way is going to actually help me in the future. Or like, this might feel like oppression now, but he can't think himself around, or at least they're sort of disproportionately unable to think themselves around being like, okay, well, yeah, maybe I feel like my life isn't my own, but it would be even worse if I weren't cis, white, heterosexual, middle class. The other reason that fascism goes after young men, and this is probably the most difficult one to deal with, is that fascism, unfortunately very correctly, identifies that the world that young men are growing up in is going to be worse for them than their fathers was and their grandfathers. They are economically downwardly mobile. They're not going to be making as much money as their parents' generation. That's just simply true, by and large. They are going to have a reduced total amount of power in society. And while, left progressives, even many centrists, even a lot of conservatives look at that and are like, yes, that's good. That's what we want. To a young man who's living that, it might feel like oppression, He thinks about his life and he's like, well, I didn't do any of these things. Why don't I get to be able to have positions of power? And fascism comes around and tells him like, well, it's because the feminists are oppressing you. You're the victim. So those are all the reasons that fascism goes after young men. It's because they're particularly vulnerable, and it's because they're particularly vulnerable, like both neurologically and because of where they are in the world.
Can you give us any, maybe one real life example of a story of someone who was recruited?
Absolutely, yeah. So in the contemporary world, there are all sorts of examples of young men who became fascists. Lots of them are because of the algorithm showed me this or that or something like that. In the historical examples, there are quite a few examples of this as well. For example, there's the Nazi namesake of the actual anthem of the Nazi party. This was a kid named Horst Wessel. Horst Wessel was not a veteran of World War I. He was too young to be in World War I. But he grew up during the Weimar period, during a period of a lot of economic and political instability. And his father was sort of a right-winger, but not a Nazi. But Wessel was recruited by the Nazi party because he was a dissatisfied, disaffected, downwardly mobile young man who wanted more power in society. He wanted the kind of power that his parents' generation had had. He was groomed, essentially, by the Nazi party to be a sort of leader, and was eventually killed for it. He was killed in partisan violence, which he instigated against some communist Germans. And he was memorialized sort of as a martyr to the Nazi party. His whole family life was subsumed by the Nazi party and Nazi identity, even to the extent that Nazi officials were the primary attendees and sort of reference points at his funeral, as opposed to his parents, who were both living, because he was like in his early 20s. Horst Wessel is a particular example of this, but there are countless other examples of people who dedicated and gave their lives to fascism, and fascism, of course, didn't give them anything in return except death, which is another really important reminder, is that as big of promises as fascism makes to young people, it has yet, in the historical record, it has yet to ever make good on those promises. Because every single time that fascism has appeared, it has been destroyed. It is a failed ideology.
And it's destroyed the countries, that it is swallowed up too. Italy, Germany were in ruins.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The war left the fascist countries of Europe in tatters, with the sole exception of Spain, which, is sort of arguable. Spain's relationship to fascism is kind of arguable because, the military was really in charge of that system, and they sort of more or less used fascism as a kind of screen and sort of an ideological glue for themselves. The fascists weren't necessarily in charge. But even Spain, was economically backward by most Western European standards until the fall of the regime in the 1960s and 70s. So fascism just simply doesn't do what it promises to do, because it has really, really, really big promises, and has so far failed to meet almost any of them.
So what sort of tactics do fascist movements use to recruit young men, and specifically what's being used today, for example, in this country?
Yeah, so fascists use whatever technological means are available to them. Lots of people make a lot of noise, and a lot of, they're really worried about memes and meme culture and the internet, and that's reasonable. But it's reasonable in the same way that back in the 1930s you would be like, oh, I don't know if you should be listening to that radio broadcast. I don't know if you should be reading that newspaper. Fascists just use, exactly like any other political movement, they use whatever mode of communication is the most powerful at the time. And so today, fascists use internet forums for some of the more hardcore stuff. Places 4chan is actually mostly down at this point because of it got taken down by some hackers. But places like 4chan, they also use more fragmentary forums and forms of text communication, like Discord servers, things like that. Fascists recruit young men in the form of memes. This is one of the ways that, for example, this guy Anglin that I was talking about, he was like, well, one of the things that we can do is flood the internet with jokes that have fascist or racist content. And this will recruit people because they won't see themselves as being recruited, right? They'll just think that they're laughing at a joke. If you come up to, he's very salient about this. He's very, very aware. He's like, if you just show up in a young person's news feed with a swastika, earnestly, they'll probably be like, I don't know. Or they'll think that it's as the kids say, cringe, right? But if you show up with a joke that has some anti-Semitic content, or a joke that has some anti-black content, and the kid laughs because, he's 12. Young people like transgressive humor. The kid laughs, and then he tells his mom, and his mom's like, that's not funny, and you shouldn't say those things. The kid will be like, aha, they were right. I'm not allowed to say these things. They're right that I'm being oppressed. It's a very insidious loop that they put young people into, and it's worked fantastically well for them. They have been extremely successful at this. So those are the primary ways that fascists are recruiting young men. A lot of the big vectors for getting this kind of content into young men's eyes are fitness influencers. So people who talk about bodybuilding, people who talk about mixed martial arts. For example, probably the most popular right-wing influencer in the world right now, Andrew Tate, a rapist and human trafficker and drug smuggler and person who commits multiple financial crimes. He got his start as a mixed martial arts influencer type, and then he just became a lifestyle rich guy influencer. So fitness is a big one. Humor is a big one. Video game culture is another big one, where young people go to forums or other outlets where they talk about, a game that they're playing, or a group of people who are playing a game together, or even just like the chat that happens in a video game. These are big ways that fascists recruit young men nowadays.
You write in your book, this relationship between fascists and conservatives goes both ways. While conservatives are using fascists to do their dirty work, fascists are using conservatives to gain momentum and legitimacy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look back in history and we see how fascism relates to conservatives, fascism relates to conservatism and other more mainstream right-wing groups, the thing to think about it is think about them as a spectrum, as an umbrella, right? In exactly the same way as the Democratic Party has people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's, some form of democratic socialist, and it also has, quote-unquote Democrats who are in places like West Virginia, right, where they might as well be Republicans. The right wing is the same. It has everybody from people like Mitt Romney, who are like moderate figures, more or less, to people like, and Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, people who are pretty right-wing, pretty openly, more or less fascist in terms of their politics. When it comes to how these groups relate to each other, it's a battle. They're battling over who is in charge of their coalition, even as the right-wing and left-wing coalitions are fighting against each other. Right? So there's two conflicts happening at once, right? Right versus left, and then inside each of these movements about who is going to be in charge. Historically, almost every single time, the conservatives, the mainstream part of the right-wing coalition, has won that battle. And they have ended up in charge of the coalition. This happened in, like I said, Spain, it happened in Portugal, it happened in Romania, it happened in Hungary, it happened in, to a lesser extent, Slovakia. This is just mostly what happens. Those are all examples from the 20s and 30s. Mostly what happens is that the conservatives use fascist groups and other more radical right-wing groups to do dirty work, like I said in the book. What that means basically is they use them to fight and intimidate. They use them to kill and attack the left. Do the dirty work that you don't want actual plainclothes or uniformed police officers being seen doing, right? So for example, Horst Wessel is a perfect example of this, right? Conservatives in Germany did not want the communists to win. And so they were like, well, who's gonna be good at fighting the communists? These Nazi guys. Let's help them fight the communists. That's exactly what they did. They said, hey, we're not really going to prosecute you if you do this. The police will probably help you. If they kill you, the communists, you might die, but if you kill them, we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to say good job, or slap you on the wrist or something. That worked. The conservatives and the Nazis beat the communists and the socialists. They destroyed them. And then, once they beat the left, there was a conflict inside the right wing over, well, now who's going to govern? Who's in charge now? Like I said, most of the time, the fascists don't get big enough. They don't have enough momentum. They don't have enough power. They don't have enough popularity to take over the right wing. They did in a couple cases. Germany, Austria, Italy. Those are the places that just outright fascists just completely took power, on their own, in their country for a prolonged period of time. In Germany, this looked well, now the fascists are saying well, we're in charge of the right wing. We're going to enact our crazy policies, and you can either go along with us or we'll kill you, or imprison you, or exile you from political life. And a lot of conservatives go along with that. So you got to think about it as this sort of symbiotic or maybe parasitic relationship between fascism and conservatism. Fascism is sort of along for the ride on the rest of the right wing, hoping that they might get their chance to sort of shoot their shot, actually go for it and try to take over the coalition.
Well, what are some signs that a young man might be getting recruited into fascism? What should we be looking for? What are some of the red flags?
Yeah, so there are a lot of pretty clear ones. Like I said earlier, young people, and especially in Western society, young men are sort of like socially positioned to be into transgressive comedy. So a kid repeating a sort of untoward joke or something like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's like being recruited by the Nazis or something like that. But if his sense of humor changes significantly, to the extent that that's what a lot of his jokes are about, if his sense of humor changes so much that like he thinks that, anti-Semitic jokes are like the funniest thing in the whole world and he tells them all the time, that's a pretty good sign. If his friend group changes pretty drastically, if he's spending a whole lot of his time on the internet where he previously wasn't, if all of the influencers and people that he talks about are pretty right-wing, if he doesn't have any female friends, that can be a sign, because women, and especially young women, are pretty savvy about knowing what is up with a lot of this stuff, and if they don't want to be around this young man, then that's a pretty good indication. It's also a pretty good indication that he might be vulnerable to recruitment, because he might be resentful of the fact that young women aren't paying attention to him. So those are some pretty good ones. Drastic changes in sense of humor, big changes in friend group structure. None of these mean like necessarily that he is being recruited or that he has been or that he's falling down this rabbit hole. It more means that he's like standing on the edge, right? You got to keep an eye out. Things that would make you for sure know is if he starts talking about dating and women in a particularly sexist way, like in terms of like needing to win women's attention, needing to trick them, needing to use the kind of like subterfuge and lies that young men often think that young women need in order to want to be with them. If he starts using talking points from what is collectively called the manosphere, which is a sort of like a big cesspool of internet dialogue about gender and sexuality, which mostly is about how most of it boils down to that women need to be tricked in order to be with men, but also that women only want to be with extremely domineering men who dominate both women and other men socially. And so if your son or a young man that you know starts talking about women in this way, that's a big warning sign.
How would I, as a parent or a caregiver, start off a conversation with my son if I feared that he were being sucked into that world? What would I say, and what would I not want to say?
Yeah, well, so the first thing is, as I say, and as the old adage goes, an ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure. In this case, the most important thing that you can do is to get out ahead of the conversation, in exactly the same way that you need to get out ahead of conversations about sexual health and sexual consent. In exactly the same way that, like, if a young man is going through puberty and like maybe going to start dating, you need to sit down and talk about what consent is and how it works, how to be a courteous and kind and good human being in this regard. In exactly the same ways you might talk to a white kid about racism and say, like, hey, you might not feel this privilege, but it's real, and here's how, and let's talk about it. So sitting down and saying, like, hey, you're going to be seeing this messaging. If you aren't seeing it already, you will. If it's not on your feed, it'll be on your friends, and they'll share it with you. Let's talk about it. So don't be afraid to be the one to introduce the concepts to them, in exactly the same way that you might be the first person as a parent or caregiver to talk to them about sexual health. Like, STIs are out there, and telling your kid that they're out there isn't going to make them more vulnerable. In the same way, fascism is out there. Telling your kid that it's out there isn't making them more vulnerable, it's making them safer. So that's the most important thing. Get out ahead of it. After that, if they're showing warning signs, or if your warnings, your like attempted inoculation didn't take, right? They're still, you feel like they're sliding somewhere. The single most important piece to remind yourself every single time is no matter, well, not necessarily no matter, but independent of how heinous or evil or disgusting the rhetoric that this young person is saying, remember that they are a child. We're talking about minors here, mostly 10 to 18. And even when we're talking about people 18 to 25, they're adults, but like, remember, their brains are not done. There are some ideas, some forms of empathy that are literally very hard for them to feel. And so it is your job, sort of uniquely, to try to feel and show about as much empathy as you possibly can. You need to be empathetic, not towards the things that they're saying, because the things that they're saying might be really heinous. You need to be empathetic towards how they are feeling. Ask them, so like, for example, your kid shares the second anti-Semitic joke that they've shared in a while, and like the first time you were like, hey, that's anti-Semitic, and I don't like that, and here's why. Just in a sort of like normal caregiving corrective type way. They share another one, you say like, hey, where's this coming from? You know? If you jump on them immediately, then they have a good narrative for that, the fascists do. It's like, okay, yeah, look, you are being oppressed. That kind of speech isn't protected. You aren't allowed to say these things. See, right? Like they are in control, right? That's the narrative that they provide. If you just immediately jump on them and condemn them. What you need to do is say like, hey, I don't think that that's funny. What do you think is funny about that? I don't see that kind of stuff on my social media. Where did you encounter it? My friends don't share that kind of stuff. Which ones of yours share it? I don't understand that. You know, I don't understand why that's a joke. Why do you think that that's a joke? What's funny about it? Start from a position of curiosity and empathy. And likely as not, the kid is just trying to be transgressive. You know, likely as not, they don't actually care or actually believe any of this stuff. They want to get a rise out of somebody. If you deny them that, then you're in a good position to make them be like, I guess this is boring, and you know, it's not actually really, I don't actually really care enough about any of this crap to like really do it or believe it, you know? If they, similarly, you know, like if a kid is talking about women in like this, in this really sort of utilitarian, sexist way, say like, hey, you know, that's not how my friends talk about sex and gender. That's not how you've heard me talk about sex and gender. Where'd you encounter that? You know, where'd you get that from? Ask them about how they feel. You know, what's going on that makes you like this? Do you feel alone? Do you feel sad? Do you want something that you don't have? Do you want a girlfriend and you don't have one? Do you want money and you don't feel like you have it? Do you want friends and you don't feel like you have them? A lot of the time, that's at the root of this kind of stuff for most young men who get into the right wing. There's always a chance, it's an unlikely chance, but there's always a chance that your kid will just end up being a true believer, though. They might just really believe it. And in that case, you need to make an evaluation for yourself. You need to think about how much risk am I willing to take for myself and the other people in my community? Do I think that they're actually threatening other people physically or verbally? And if they are, you might need to expel them from your community, at least for a while, and say like, hey, there's space for you if you want to come back, but you can't be here right now. Now, that's not something you can do to a minor, but if you're talking about like an 18 to 25-year-old, yeah, you can just be like, hey, like, this isn't stuff that I want in my life. We've talked about it. I've asked you to keep it out of my life. I've asked you to keep it out of my community. You haven't. When you're willing to do that, you can come back and make amends. Essentially, treating it in the same way that you might treat a kid who's fallen into a drug problem, right? The first step isn't kick them out of the house. The first step is, hey, what's going on? Where'd you find this stuff? Who are you sharing it with? What's happening in your life that makes you want this? You know, what is it that this is doing for you? Is it providing community? Is it providing an escape? Are there mental health stuff? Is there mental health stuff underlying this that we can maybe address? You try, right? You show empathy, you show care, you show understanding. Even as they're making very, very big mistakes. But if they keep making those mistakes and refuse to stop, if they hurt and threaten other people, then you have to be like, hey, I can't deal with this anymore. This is when you put up a boundary with somebody who has a drug problem. You say, here's where it stops for me. If you are willing to do the work that you need to step back across this line, back inside of my world, then I'll accept you. I say yes. I want you back. Leaving those doors open is the only option at that point.
And as you point out in your book, it's also a risky move because that kind of expulsion can push them further into the arms of a community that they feel accepts them.
Exactly. That's the ultimate worry, and it's the reason that pushing them away fully can really only be the last resort. Mm-hmm. And it might be something you need to do if they're threatening themselves or others physically or verbally, right? Like, I'm not encouraging you to keep a young man in your life if he is threatening you or threatening other people in your community. No. You might have to say, you're not welcome here right now. But you have to know that if you do that, that's just going to push him away. And that's the big version of this. But the small version is, your son shares, like I said, an off-color joke. If you just yell and scream or say shut up, I don't want to hear that, that's not welcome in our house. If you just come at him with anger and violence and aggression, which is appropriate when dealing with stuff like this is really terrible stuff. It's reasonable to feel that way. And it's the appropriate reaction when you're dealing with it in public. If somebody says an anti-Semitic slur, a homophobic slur, a racist slur in public, the correct response is to say, shut up, get out of here, you're not welcome here. That's the right thing to do. But when you're dealing with a young person at home, when you're dealing with somebody whose name you know, that's only going to drive them further and further into the arms of the people who are getting them to say this stuff. The only option, if you want to get them out, is to show empathy, which is extremely hard, terrifying, vulnerable, dangerous work, which is essentially why I felt I could only justifiably ask parents, educators, caregivers to do that kind of work. Those are the only people that you could really ask that of. You can't ask that of a stranger.
Now, fortunately, historically, as you point out, fascism doesn't always succeed, and you talked a little bit about that. Sometimes it is defeated. And you write, and let me quote from your book, in the fight against fascism, groups from across the ideological spectrum have always come together and united to stop it. Can you give some examples of that? And what would it take, do you think, to defeat the kind of fascism we're facing now?
Yeah, so back in the day, and this is, back in the 20s and 30s, there was something called the Popular Front. The Popular Front was an idea that originated with communist parties in Europe, but which came to be sort of the signifier for everybody who is opposed to fascism. So the Popular Front could be everything from a parliamentary coalition to stop fascists from taking power, to the Allies in World War II, right? The Allies in World War II were a collection of actual communists, right, in the Soviet Union, sort of liberal democracy in the United States, a more leftist kind of democracy in France, and a constitutional monarchy that was pretty conservative in the form of the United Kingdom. They got together across a big ideological spectrum, right? That's covering everything from the far left to like right of center. They all got together and they wanted to stop fascism. So that's one example. Another perfect example that's happening today, right now, is the governing coalition in Germany right now. The governing coalition in Germany is a coalition of the right and left-wing parties, specifically the center-right and center-left-wing parties. That is the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the left and right center parties respectively in Germany. They are united because the Christian Democrats, who are the right-wing party, they are not big enough to govern Germany by themselves. They need to form a coalition. One party that they could form a coalition with is Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, which is a far right-wing party that the German government has very recently explicitly called right-wing in a sense that is like bordering on illegal in Germany, because Germany has pretty robust anti-Nazi laws, right? So the CDU, the center-right party, they can't govern by themselves. They need a coalition partner. But they have said, we will never form a coalition with AfD because they're fascists. We can't work with them. So we'll work with the center-left party instead, forming something called a Grand Coalition. One could imagine something like this having happened in the United States. If you remember in 2020 and also 2024, when Trump was running, these were the Never Trump Republicans, right? The Never Trump Republicans, like people like Dick Cheney saying, don't vote for Donald Trump. Vote for the Democrats instead. That's a grand coalition. It didn't work in the United States, but you can imagine it having worked, right? It's conceivable that it might have worked. In the United States today, if we think about the enemies of fascism, it's like a lot of people. It's everybody from actual communists to, sort of liberal Obama-type Democrats to people like Mitt Romney, who are pretty conservative. But they all still don't want fascism. And there's a lot more of those people than there are fascists, right? Fascists, basically, in the historical record, top out at about a third of a country. That's probably the biggest that a fascist party could probably get. It's the biggest that they've ever gotten, realistically, in terms of vote share. So I'd be pretty surprised if they got a lot more than that anywhere. That means that in order to stop them, you got, a majority of the population to work with. The question is just, how good are you going to be at working together? In 2024, Donald Trump won the popular vote, but he won a minority of the voters because, about a third of the people stayed home, right? A lot of those people were probably dissatisfied with Trump and also dissatisfied with Biden.
Well, we've been talking with Dr. Craig Johnson, who's an independent journalist and the author of a new book, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism. He's also the host of the popular podcast, 15 Minutes of Fascism. And where can we find that?
So that is available anywhere that you want to look for podcasts. It's hosted on SoundCloud, but it's on Spotify. It's on Apple Play. I also recently started a YouTube channel at 15 Minutes of Fascism on YouTube.
Great. And your book is available on Amazon and where their good books are sold.
Yeah, exactly. Amazon, order from your local bookstore, order directly from Routledge. Sometimes Routledge often has like 20% off sales, so that'd be the place I'd suggest to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much for making time for us. Thank you for all that you shared, and definitely food for thought. And
absolutely. Thank you so much. Lovely to talk.
Great. And thank you all for tuning in. This is S.J. Munson signing out.